slip away from all notions of domination and truth, delving into our story about stories, telling, so to say, a bedtime story of the second order. But let us start at the beginning, with the very first sentence. The very first word might already tell us a story, and this might as well be our beginning. Thinking systemically, let us take a closer look at the meaning of the word system itself, asking what it means and how it comes about that an agglomeration of elements is transformed into parts of a system. Deriving from the Greek, the word system is a composite of two words, syn, together, and histanai, to position, to stand. We arrive at a literal meaning of a system as something that stands together. From this view, the very moment in which the single parts, the single elements cease to stand alone but rather stand together, they turn into a system. Seeing this, a change has already occurred. Our question has turned towards ourselves. And now every story itself is already a system. In recognizing a story, we have transformed an agglomeration of letters, words, and sentences into a system, our story. Now, from assuming that every story as recognized as a story represents a kind of system, what is the special quality of a systemic story? Might it be that this turning towards ourselves might already be what makes a systemic story, as it tells us how its single parts actually become a system? Speaking from our recent experience, it might indeed be useful to characterize a systemic story through this particular way of understanding, by which we ourselves, the people around us, or perhaps even the whole world, transforms into a part of our story. After all, this is what we have set as our goal, our way, part of which we have just gone. And if the meaning of a system is what it does, then this is our start. Startling. It makes one wonder, thinking again, how do you arrive at this? How did you become part of this story? And if you dare to think about it for a moment, you already notice what you are doing. You are thinking. And as you think of it, you are thinking systemically. And the letters, sounds, and words transform into a story. And again, our system unfolds. It almost works as if there is no getting away from it. However, it is easy enough to find out that as soon as you are thinking, "What nonsense! What is he thinking? Enough of this!" the story will end immediately. As your thoughts cease, our system dissolves. So, how come readers and listeners are moved in a way to think systemically? Continue our story and say, "How wonderful! I've been thinking systemically all along. I've succeeded in inventing and maintaining a tremendous story without any effort. Now, I really have to find out in detail how this systemic thinking works and that makes me invent such incredible stories." Now, if we indeed want to participate, understand, and maintain systemic thinking, several questions come forth. Again, what makes it systemic? What is the necessary context which embraces it? What are the parts which connect the patterns of systemic thinking? Which way of thinking and acting puts it into operation, and what keeps it going? Let us try to explore these issues together. First, surely recognizing that you are part of something, a part of this story, a part of this society, of this world, of this system, is a condition sine qua non for systemic thinking. Yet this alone is not enough. And even though this perspective may constitute an extraordinary insight of systemic thinking, it is merely talking about the result, not the process of systemic thinking. What matters, what really matters, are the conclusions we draw from this insight. As whether our thinking is systemic or not completely depends on the form of experience in which we ourselves become immersed in this insight. In other words, our thinking is only systemic if its impact is systemic, if it joins different parts of a system and relates them to each other. Whatever the narrator and the audience experience together, only this is what becomes the story. If we lose this relation and the quality of experience that goes with it, our system falls apart. We cease to perceive ourselves as part of a greater unity. In this, we lose our ability to think systemically, and there is nothing left that we can refer to in our thinking. This is why systemic thinking necessarily has to be an experience-related thinking, or in its essence, a thinking experience. In the context of a story, this means, once a story is told, those who experience it, the narrator and the audience, are always the actual actors of a story. They are the single parts through which the story becomes a whole, a community, a system. The very moment the single parts, sentences, and thoughts transform into a communal experience, the story takes on shape. That this fascinating system we call a story, recorded through our written and even longer all our spoken story of humankind, stays in existence, it has proven useful to invent these constant roles which we insist on maintaining, from which we don't want to deviate, so that the story may continue to develop. The apparently active part of these roles is the narrator or author, whose task consists in telling the story in such a way that it is intuitively recognized as a story made up, written or told by somebody for somebody. It is up to the narrator to create possible points of reference and a context within which the reader and narrator can meet. Only when the narrator allows other narrators to participate in his experience, a system will develop within which their stories and thoughts can relate. The apparently passive parts are the recipients of a story, the people listening or reading. Thinking systemically, they bear a much greater responsibility than we usually think. For it goes to show that it is only the outer appearance of the listener's tranquility which leads us to believe that listening is something passive. To understand this responsibility, one has to become attentive to the intrinsic connectedness of both sides within the context of storytelling, perhaps best expressed by Heinz von Foersters' hermeneutic imperative. It is the listener, not the speaker, that determines the meaning of an utterance. When the listener tires, the speaker's words turn into grunts and hisses. And for the tired reader, even the most meaningful sentences are immediately replaced by innumerable black dots all of a sudden. Thus, readers and listeners are the gates as well as the gatekeepers of the stories and authors' ideas. The entire impact and meaning of systemic ideas, stories, and reflections at any moment of their occurring depends on them. That the readers and listeners are as important as narrators and authors has usually been overlooked within a one-sided view, even to a degree that as we are not paying attention to these apparently passive roles, fall into the delusion that there is nobody listening at all, and that the words and the events they tell about had a meaning by themselves. But of course, as there cannot be an active side without a passive side, if you follow this view very strictly, you are bound to experience a world where words and events have no meaning at all. A systemic thinker could even agree to this point, to this view of words and events having no meaning, though he might ask the question, meaningless for whom? And thus reintroduce the observer. However, for the continuation of our story in taking systemic thinking and the development of our systemic story seriously, another way of thinking becomes relevant as it immediately becomes clear that systemic stories and thinking only come forth where both sides come together, where their encounter happens. Narrator and listener, author and reader, are pulling at the same end of the rope, co-inventing their stories together, the same system-oriented thought accounting for both of them. See the connecting patterns and enter into their relations. As soon as we follow this thought and we start to see the patterns establishing our relations, experiencing us as parts of a common system, this leads us to a twofold systemic feedback loop, deriving from Heinz von Foersters' aesthetic imperative: if you desire to see, learn how to act. So, if you want to see, you have to learn how to act. But if you want to act, you have to learn how to see. As long as the twofold feedback loop is maintained, a system remains a system and does not fall apart into its parts. Through learning to act through our seeing and learning to see through our acting, a circularity comes forth, through which we can see that our perspectives are inseparably connected with our actions. In experiencing how our perspectives bring forth actions, while our actions are brought into existence through our perspectives, our thinking and our acting become systemic. Actions and reflections merge into each other. Sight and insight form an indivisible unity. This merging gives birth to another phenomenon, which has fascinated humanity since time immemorial, or at least since Socrates said, "I know that I don't know," and the famous ancient oracle, "Know thyself," the phenomenon of self-reference. The very moment we cease to experience our thoughts and reflections as units, as categories separated from our actions, but begin to experience them both as an interconnected unity, we begin to perceive that we perceive. We experience how our perceiving, our thinking, constitute forms of actions, one after the other and all at the same time, as we experience the ongoing coming forth together of action and perception. It is in this beginning, in perceiving how we perceive, that we begin getting to know ourselves. Now, this may seem incredibly complex and mysterious, and indeed it is. The most mysterious of it is that it is exactly this incredible complexity and this mysteriousness that we are immersed in every day. Being part of this complexity, we are tuning into this cycle of unheard of diversity and amazement, moment to moment. This tuning in with and co-inventing of our environment and our fellow men functions in such a way that is so successful in our everyday routines that we are not even aware of our doing so. When the movement of muscles causes air to set certain membranes of the throat into vibration, we suddenly hear our own voice. When we see how we move one hand to scratch the other arm, still thinking about the meaning of this action, infinitely complex sensory motoric feedback loops arise. Just by themselves, these most simple actions require extensive self-organization. Not to speak about these far more complex phenomena which are taking place if a group of people actually succeed to come to an understanding of a common concept, such as identity or the self. Or in an even more diverse coming together of the abstract and the concrete. When our fellow humans are well disposed and don't regard us as crazy.